Just after 1 o'clock on a cold Thursday afternoon in January of 1983, in a hotel parking lot north of Chicago, two men walked up behind a 60-year-old insurance executive. They announced it was a robbery, but the man allegedly being robbed had a treasure trove of dark secrets. Then, before any attempt to actually commit a robbery, one of them fired 8 times, and both men walked away without taking a single thing. The man on the asphalt was 3 weeks from a federal sentencing that could have kept him in prison for the rest of his life. The robbery was fake, but the message was real, and more than 40 years later, nobody's ever been charged, even though detectives know the organization behind the attack. In 1949, Allen Dorfman was teaching physical education at the University of Illinois for roughly $4,000 a year. He was Chicago native, from a working-class family, a graduate of Westside Marshall High School, and a decorated Marine who'd earned a Silver Star on Iwo Jima. Nothing about that life suggested that within 5 years he'd be a millionaire, or that his violent end would be called one of the biggest organized crime mysteries Chicago had ever seen. What changed everything was his stepfather and the circles this man ran in. Red Dorfman ran the Chicago Waste Handlers Union, and congressional investigators would later describe him as the living link between the Teamsters Union and the Chicago underworld. In 1949, an ambitious Teamsters leader out of Detroit named Jimmy Hoffa needed exactly the kind of introductions Red could provide. According to FBI files, the two men struck a deal that both their families would live off for the next 30 years. Red would open doors to the Chicago mob, and in exchange, Hoffa would steer the Teamsters insurance business to Red's family. That's how a gym teacher with no insurance experience whatsoever ended up running an insurance agency alongside his mother, Rose. The Teamsters' first contract with the new agency arrived in 1950, and the money never stopped coming. During the first 8 years of handling Union Welfare Fund business, the Dorfmans reportedly collected more than $3 million in commissions and fees. Allen was a millionaire within 5 years of leaving the gym behind, a meteoric rise to wealth. Congress noticed. A House committee began asking questions about the arrangement as early as 1953, and both Dorfmans refused to cooperate. 6 years later, the McClellan Committee dug into the fees the Teamsters were paying the family and suspected that some of the cash flowing out of the agency was ending up in Hoffa's pockets. Nothing stuck, but it was the beginning of a pattern that would hold for most of Allen Dorfman's life. Dorfman's real power ran through the Central States Pension Fund. It held the retirement money of hundreds of thousands of Teamsters, truck drivers, and warehouse workers across the middle of the country. By the late 1950s, Dorfman had worked his way into the business of approving its loans. Borrowers the banks wouldn't touch had a habit of turning up at Central States Pension Fund. The money Dorfman approved flowed out to real estate men with the right friends and casino operators with the right partners. When Hoffa went to prison in 1967, Dorfman effectively took control of the fund itself, vastly increasing his own power. Under his influence, the pension fund became something close to a private bank for organized crime. Money that was supposed to secure the retirements of working men flowed, most famously, into Las Vegas. The fund bankrolled the Argent Corporation, a company that owned a number of shady casinos in Vegas. Those casinos were being systematically skimmed, with profits siphoned off the top and carried back to crime families in the Midwest. It took until 1986 for the skimming convictions to land, and when they did, they took down the outfit's boss, Joey Iupa, and his underboss, Jackie Cerrone. If you've seen the movie Casino, you've seen a dramatized version of this exact machine. The character Andy Stone, the smooth pension fund man played by Alan King, was based on Dorfman himself. The government kept trying to pull him down, and he kept slipping the hook. When Hoffa was convicted of jury tampering in 1964, Dorfman stood trial on the same charge and walked out acquitted. A Chicago outfit boss was reportedly once overheard explaining Dorfman's position with unusual clarity. He said in effect that Allen himself was meek and harmless, but the people who owned a piece of him were anything but. That was the arrangement in a single sentence, and it's what made him such a valuable asset to the mob. Dorfman was the respectable face, the cool guy with the perpetual tan, and the immaculate suits who was on a first-name basis with politicians and Hollywood stars. He wasn't the sort of person who got his hands dirty, but the men standing behind him were the Chicago outfit. Only once in the first 50 years of his life did anything stick to Dorfman. In 1972, Dorfman was convicted of taking a $55,000 kickback on a pension fund loan, and he spent the better part of a year in federal prison. The more instructive story is the case that didn't stick right after his release. In February of 1974, Dorfman was indicted over $1.4 million in pension fund loans to a plastics company in Deming, New Mexico. His co-defendants were a who's who of the outfit's orbit. Joey Lombardo, one of the most powerful men in the outfit, and the mob's man in Las Vegas, Tony Spilotro, were charged as well. A prominent bail bondsman named Erwin Weiner was also charged, a man whose circle of acquaintances famously included Jack Ruby. Remember that name? Not Jack Ruby, but Weiner, because as we go on, there will be a lot more Weiner in this narrative. And full disclosure, when I was writing the script for this video, I actually misread his name, believing it was Weiner, but I'm keeping the joke in, despite the fact that it doesn't work. The government's key witness was a young businessman named Daniel Seifert, who'd run one of the companies involved and was prepared to testify against all of them. In September of 1974, months before trial, masked gunmen cut Seifert down at his factory in Bensenville, Illinois, in front of his wife and 4-year-old son. With its star witness gone, the government's case collapsed, and Dorfman and his co-defendants went free in 1975. It took 33 years for anyone to answer for it, and in 2007, the sprawling Family Secrets mob trial finally convicted Lombardo of Seifert's slaying. New pension laws formally stripped Dorfman of his role in the fund by 1977, but investigators never believed his grip had loosened. His company, Amalgamated Insurance Agency, still processed claims for the Teamsters, and the loans he'd blessed were still paying dividends to the outfit through intermediaries. Whatever the organizational chart said, Dorfman remained the man who knew how everything connected. In 1979, the FBI planted hidden microphones inside Amalgamated's Chicago offices. They were aiming squarely at Dorfman's role in steering Teamsters' pension money toward mob-connected casinos in Las Vegas. The operation got a name that told you exactly who the target was: Pendorf, short for penetration of Dorfman. And yeah, in case you're wondering, that one took a few takes to get down in my signature style, but I digress. The bugs delivered a flood of conversations the government could only have dreamed about. Court records from the case describe intercepted talk of hidden interests in the Aladdin Hotel and Casino. The charges that finally stuck, though, came from a different direction entirely. In May of 1981, a federal grand jury indicted Dorfman and 4 others, and on December 15, 1982, a jury convicted all of them. The conviction was for conspiring to bribe a sitting United States Senator, Howard Cannon of Nevada. Prosecutors laid out a January 1979 meeting in Cannon's Las Vegas office, where the conspirators allegedly offered him a choice piece of Teamster-owned land at a bargain price. In exchange, Cannon was supposed to help stall a bill deregulating the trucking industry, legislation the Teamsters and their silent partners badly wanted quashed. Cannon himself denied that any bribe had ever been offered, and he was never charged with a crime. Dorfman now faced as much as 55 years in prison, with sentencing set for February 10th, 1983. The trial judge initially set his bond at $5 million, and an appeals court later cut it to $1 million, plus some of the stock in his companies as collateral. He posted it and went home to wait, something that would come to be seen as a fatal mistake. The pressure kept building through January. A federal judge froze Amalgamated's assets to keep Dorfman from liquidating everything and running, but the order was allowed to lapse in the third week of the month. A week before his sentencing date, prosecutors in San Francisco indicted him again, this time over an alleged scheme to loot a union's funds out west. He was also awaiting trial alongside Lombardo for allegedly extorting $800,000 from a Chicago area developer named Robert Kendler. And somewhere in Chicago, according to investigators, a conversation was happening about the cold calculus on what the outfit should do with their old pal Dorfman. Dorfman was 60 years old and looking at what amounted to a life sentence, and men in that position make deals. Dorfman knew the pension fund, the skim, the bribes, and the bodies. He even had a paper trail stretching back to Hoffa himself. He wasn't just a cog in the machine, he was one of the architects of the entire machinery that kept the money flowing. The outfit had watched the government flip witnesses before, and reportedly concluded that a man with that much to trade couldn't be allowed to reach a bargaining table. January 20th, 1983 was a cold Thursday in Lincolnwood, a small suburb pressed against Chicago's northern edge. Dorfman spent the late morning running errands with his old friend, Irwin Weiner, the same bail bondsman who'd been his co-defendant back in 1974. The two men finished a transaction at the First National Bank of Lincolnwood and drove Dorfman's Cadillac to the Hyatt House Hotel at Towey and Lincoln Avenues. They had a lunch date at Tessie's, the restaurant inside. In the back seat of the car sat a video cassette of the verdict, the new Paul Newman picture about a broken-down lawyer gambling everything on one last trial. While this may have been a complete coincidence, some investigators believe that this tape was deliberately placed there to send a message. From the parking spot to the door was about 100 feet, but Dorfman never covered that stretch. At 1:07 in the afternoon, as the two men passed between parked cars, two figures came up fast behind them, and one shouted that this was a stick-up. Police said the shooting began almost instantly, which is to say the robbery announcement was never a robbery at all. A .22 caliber fired 8 rounds at close range, and at least 7 of them struck Dorfman in the head. He collapsed between the cars and was pronounced dead a short time later at a hospital in neighboring Skokie. The attackers vanished, and they hadn't taken a thing, again immediately calling in to doubt the robbery motive. The head of the FBI's Chicago office said as much publicly within hours. This was no robbery. It was a premeditated hit. Even by Chicago standards, it was brazen almost beyond precedent, carried out in broad daylight outside a busy hotel at lunchtime. Weiner, standing close enough to touch his friend when the shooting started, wasn't hit. By his own account and the accounts of witnesses at the scene, the assailants never even threatened him. The physical evidence surfaced quickly, and then the case went nowhere for 4 decades. Days after the shooting, a janitor emptying trash behind St. Cornelius, a Catholic school on Chicago's northwest side, found a .22 with a silencer attached. He also found a set of incomplete Illinois license plates dumped in the same trash bin. Police believed they were holding the weapon that had shot Dorfman down, though the test results were never publicly released. The plates had been stolen off a car in Chinatown the previous summer, and investigators traced them to the getaway vehicle. The witnesses were independently able to confirm that the license plate matched the one in the trash. There the trail ended. At least 4 witnesses had seen the attackers, and none of it produced a single arrest. Attention fell immediately on Weiner, and police questioned him for hours in the wake of the events. While he was never named a suspect, investigators acknowledged that his actions were under scrutiny. He was a lifelong friend of mob figures. He'd walked Dorfman across that parking lot, and he'd been left untouched by men firing 8 rounds at point-blank range. Writers on the Chicago outfit have argued ever since that Weiner delivered his friend to the ambush, though these are simply allegations and the result of underworld chatter. Weiner was never charged with anything, and his account never got more elaborate than what he told police that first afternoon. 2 strangers announced a stick-up and started shooting, and that was all he knew. Or at least, that's all he would tell the cops. Some have questioned the narrative of his involvement, noting that Dorfman wasn't exactly a hard individual to find at the time. In fact, it's been floated that the whole thing was also a message to Weiner, a not-so-subtle way of telling him that he better keep in line. Weiner, for his part, passed away in 1996, so if he was at all involved in the ambush, then he's long beyond the reach of justice. Dorfman's own attorney offered a different accusation within hours, telling reporters in effect that the federal government bore the blame for his client's demise. It's an odd theory, but in essence, publicly, this attorney professed a belief that the government wanted his client 6 feet under. Personally, I find that a bit hard to believe, given that Dorfman could have likely been flipped. What happened to Roy Williams, the Teamsters president, afterward only sharpened the theory that the Chicago outfit had gotten Dorfman. The Teamsters president drew a 55-year sentence that spring, and within a few years he did exactly what the mob had feared Dorfman would do. He admitted he'd operated for years under the thumb of a Kansas City mob boss and became a cooperating government witness. His 55 years didn't survive the cooperation either. The sentence was cut to 10, and he was paroled before the decade was out. Every secret Williams gave up was a reminder of what Dorfman might have delivered, and Dorfman had known far more. Now, the timelines don't add up perfectly, clearly, but high-ranking members of the Chicago outfit clearly had an understanding for what I'll euphemistically call risk management. As with most of these mob hits, I highly doubt we'll be seeing any resolution to the case at any time in the near future. Hey everyone, it's Jimmy with my usual quick reminder to ring the notification bell and turn on all notifications. Also, don't forget to check out my Instagram, Lazy Chill Zone, where I post videos and pictures of my dog. Someone made the deposit that night. The bank's camera in downtown Gilmer, Texas caught a figure at the night drop, and the video store's money made it safely into the account. But the footage was grainy, and to this day nobody can swear the person on that tape was Kelly Day Wilson. Whoever fed the store's money into that slot on January 5th, 1992, may have been the last person to ever see her. Or it may have been somebody else's hands on the bag. That blur of videotape is the closest thing to a final trace of a 17-year-old girl that exists, and it can't even confirm she was there. But this isn't your usual missing person case, and this one would come face to face with one of the most disturbing cases of mass hysteria in 20th century America. Gilmer sits in the piney woods of Upshur County in East Texas, a town of around 5,000 people arranged around a courthouse square. In January 1992, Kelly Day Wilson was a student at Gilmer High School with a part-time job at Northeast Texas Video on Buffalo Street. She'd turned 17 the previous May, stood 5'7", and weighed about 120 pounds. She'd bleached her naturally brown hair blonde sometime earlier, and that winter the dark roots were growing out, a detail that sounds trivial and turns out to matter enormously. Remember this going forward. Kelly was reported missing as a blonde young woman, but the vast majority of her hair was brown at the time she vanished. On the evening of Sunday, January 5th, Kelly closed the store with her manager, Joe Henry. And to jump ahead a bit, Joe Henry is a legitimately bad guy, for reasons I'll get into later in this segment. But keep that in mind at this point, since it wasn't known to anyone yet. Around 8:30, they said goodnight, and part of her routine was carrying the day's cash to the bank around the corner and dropping it through the night slot. Henry locked up, Kelly headed toward the bank, and that's where the firm record of her life comes to a close. And as a quick aside, I find it somewhat unusual that a manager had a 17-year-old trot over to the local bank at night with the day's cash. Perhaps I just grew up in a different time, but it seems to me that this is a task that's usually handled by the manager of a company or the owner of the business. Kelly never came home, and the next morning her stepfather went looking and found her car still parked in the video store's lot. Joe Henry, the store's manager, had already opened up the store that morning and had actually seen the vehicle sitting there already, but more on that in a moment. Notably, one tire had been slashed, while the other three sat untouched and apparently not tampered with. Her purse and personal belongings were inside the car, but her keys were gone, and there was no sign of a struggle near the vehicle, and nothing pointing toward where she went. Henry later said he'd figured at first that Kelly had simply stayed out all night, and that real worry only set in when she missed her noon shift. By then the police were already involved thanks to her stepfather's call, and they moved quickly. Investigators made one early arrest. A 17-year-old named Michael Bybee admitted to slashing the tire and was convicted of misdemeanor criminal mischief. He insisted he knew nothing about Kelly's disappearance and had simply picked the worst imaginable night for a dumb prank. Nothing ever tied him to whatever happened afterward, but that tire has hung over the case for 3 decades. If it really was a prank, it's a brutal coincidence. If it wasn't, then someone deliberately disabled her car to make sure she couldn't drive away from them. The investigation fell largely to Sergeant James Brown of the Gilmer Police Department. By most accounts, Brown became consumed, reportedly spending evenings and even his own vacation time chasing leads, despite the fact there weren't many to chase. Kelly's boyfriend, Chris Denton, drew the hardest early scrutiny because he reportedly had a hot temper, but no evidence ever connected him to that night. Henry, the last known person to see her, allegedly passed a polygraph and had alibis that have never been released, but which cops claim held up. Detectives went over the bank footage and got nothing usable from it, and ultimately it was unclear if Kelly actually made it to the bank. Searches turned up no trace of her, and no credible sighting ever surfaced. Without a witness or a shred of physical evidence, the case sat open while the rumor mill did what rumor mills do in a town that size. To contextualize what happened next, you have to remember what era this was. Through the late 80s and early 90s, a wave of panic over supposed satanic rituals swept across America. This produced sprawling daycare prosecutions and televised warnings about devil worshippers hiding in ordinary neighborhoods. In the most ridiculed versions, heavy metal music and Dungeons and Dragons were accused of turning ordinary Americans into devoted servants of the Dark Lord. Almost none of it survived scrutiny, at least officially, and the whole thing has largely been dismissed as a case of mass hysteria that swept society. The McMartin case in California, at the time the most expensive criminal trial in American history, had already collapsed without producing a single conviction. Gilmer was about to become one of the last and strangest chapters of that whole episode. Between May 1993 and January 1994, an Upshur County grand jury handed down 48 indictments accusing 9 adults of engaging in occult ritual crimes. District Attorney Tim Cohn recused himself, and a Galveston attorney named Scott Lyford was appointed special prosecutor. Lyford assembled a team of caseworkers, hired occult investigators, and the stories quickly became extremely bizarre and disconcerting. They spoke of individuals with dark robes, rituals, and a secret cult operating in the woods outside town. Then the young witnesses started talking about a blonde young woman who the cult had snatched up. In January 1994, almost exactly 2 years after Kelly vanished, Lyford's team charged 8 people in her abduction and presumed death. Among them was Sergeant James Brown, the very officer who'd spent those 2 years leading the search for her. According to the indictments, the group had held Kelly captive for more than a week before ultimately sacrificing her in some sort of deranged ritual. The prosecution team's files reportedly went further still, describing rituals that read like something out of medieval manuscripts, though not one victim of any of it was ever produced. Coverage on Kelly's disappearance exploded nationwide and even internationally, which perhaps shouldn't be too surprising given the shocking nature of the claims. However, the problems were visible almost immediately, and the biggest problem was there was no genuine physical evidence connecting anyone to anything. Bone fragments recovered during searches were reportedly examined and turned out to be animal remains. Lyford reportedly took the position that the very absence of evidence showed how sophisticated these cultists were, which is the kind of reasoning that can never lose an argument. Every time evidence wasn't found, the idea that the cultists had been using dark magic and rituals to enhance their evil powers explained why there was no evidence. More problematically, one of the accused, a truck driver named Wendell Kerr, had trucking records placing him in Buffalo, New York, when the ritual supposedly took place. Brown's attorney alerted the Texas Attorney General's office, and in March 1994, Upshur County officials formally asked Attorney General Dan Morales to take over both sets of cases. Assistant Attorney General Shane Phelps began pulling the threads, and what the state found ended everything. The statements underpinning the charges had been manufactured through coercion by the apparent experts hired by the prosecution to help build the case. The young witnesses had been interviewed for hours at a stretch, coached by adults from the prosecution team. One foster family used what they called a holding technique, running their charges up and down stairs to exhaustion until they confessed to the alleged rituals they had seen. The family believed this exhaustion technique was a form of exorcism to ensure true evidence of the rituals came out. Dr. Bruce Perry, a psychiatrist brought in by the state, concluded the youngsters had been gravely harmed by the very system that claimed to be rescuing them. The charges over Kelly's presumed death were dismissed roughly 2 months after they were filed, and after that the state moved on the more generalized ritual cases too. In a 13-page motion filed in Judge James Zimmerman's court, the Attorney General's office wrote that the prosecutions had been so thoroughly poisoned by lies and coercion. It was all done in service of exposing an alleged cult the Lyford team desperately wanted to believe in, that no credible witness remained. The court was asked to dismiss all but 3 of the charges, and the state publicly apologized to Brown. Years later, one of the witnesses who said he'd seen Kelly Wilson said that he had been coached by adults to say that he saw a blonde woman matching her description captured by the cultists. Importantly, by the night she disappeared, her bleached hair had been growing out to its natural brown, with only the tips being blonde. Vindication didn't put anything back together, and James Brown's law enforcement career in Gilmer was over. His health reportedly collapsed under the strain, and he eventually left town while some neighbors still whispered that he'd gotten away with it. His lawsuit against the people who prosecuted him was thrown out on immunity grounds, and the Supreme Court declined to hear the case in 2002. The other names in the file faded out one by one, to greater or lesser extents. Michael Beebe, the tire slasher, appears to have completely dropped out of the public record, and whatever happened to him remains unknown. Chris Denton, her boyfriend, passed from cancer in 2004, maintaining his innocence to the end. That same year, Joe Henry, the manager, was arrested on charges of possessing the most disgusting and objectionable images known to man. Notably, investigators claim that there's no evidence that Joe Henry was involved in Kelly's disappearance. Personally, though, I think given his criminal history and the fact that he was the last one to see her, the cops likely need to lean on him a little more heavily. I also find it highly unusual that he noticed her vehicle at the video store that morning and simply chose to believe that she left it there overnight. It just doesn't have the air of reality to me, which isn't to say that he did it, but that he deserves a serious second look.